Welcome to A Fresh Face in Hell. I'm your host, Johnetta Elzie. Every week we talk to someone new and interesting, somebody intellectually curious, somebody who will hopefully renew our faith in this cold, cruel world we live in. A Fresh Face in Hell. So clearly, racism has reached a pitch in America today, the likes we haven't seen in maybe, 70 years? Definitely not in my lifetime. Um, Racists are emboldened to terrifying effect in the present moment. We've got Republican leadership flying seagulls. We've got hate crimes on the rise. We've got a large percent of the population gleefully celebrating executive orders which basically seek to strip marginalized people of their voices and their rights. And obviously, all of this threatens to destroy any shred of American, quote, greatness that may still exist. Democratic leadership doesn't seem up to the task to protecting anybody. The courts are going to take a long time. So what's left? Today, we're going to talk about resistance. There's one sector of the population in America that's been dealing with this bullshit forever and fighting back tirelessly in the name of human and civil rights, and that's Black America, who has a legacy of organized resistance stretching back well over a century. So today we're going to talk to somebody who has chronicled the history of young Black activism and resistance in this country. Rita Omokha is a Nigerian-American journalist and author. She is a contributing writer for The Guardian, Vanity Fair, and Elle. She's an adjunct professor of journalism at Columbia School of Journalism, and she's the author of Resist: How a Century of Young Black Activists Saved America. She's a badass, and I hope a messenger with an antidote to our troubled times. Rita comes to us today from New York City, so please welcome to A Fresh Face in Hell, Rita Omokha. Thanks so much for joining us, Rita.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Resist offers such a comprehensive history of Black youth activism in America. From the earliest HBCU protests in the 1920s to the Harlem Renaissance, Barbara Johns, Charlie Cobb, the Wilmington 10, to the Black Panthers and beyond. You began this book in 2020 in the wake of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Patrick Kimmons, and it began with a road trip. What was the impetus of this journey?
Yeah, that's a great summary. I appreciate that. So 2020, so May 20th, 2020, I graduated from Columbia with my master's in journalism. And obviously, if you remember, 5 days later, George Floyd was murdered. And just watching how he died, I think really sparked something inside of me. I think because primarily as an immigrant to this country, I was born in Nigeria, I was raised here in the South Bronx. I don't think I ever understood race or racism or discrimination the way that I think I could have to better help me understand this country. But also, I think it was kind of a privilege to not know what I know now, to help me navigate this country the way I did. So watching George Floyd be murdered in the way that he was murdered, it really did something to me to start to contend with my identity, with my Blackness, with my Nigerian heritage. And I started to question, why didn't I think more about the impact of being this skin color in this country? So the blessing I had too was that from graduating from Columbia, I graduated top of my class, and that came a lot of money. And one of the fellowships was called the Pulitzer Traveling Fellowship. So something about that word traveling kind of put the idea in my head to go across the country, travel, and have conversations with everyday people about how they were contending with that time. I think 2020 was just a compounding year of so much happening. The deaths of Breonna Taylor, as you mentioned, Ahmaud Arbery, and then George Floyd, and then the pandemic. People were just going through a confluence of things. And I really wanted to just travel across the country, have that conversation. And that's what I did. In the end, I went to 30 states in 32 days. And one of the stops that I went to was in Portland. And in Portland, that's where the idea for the book really cemented for me, because I went to my first ever protest, and it was led by young people, teenagers, 13, 14, 15-year-olds. And just watching them be so audacious in how they were moving and organizing, I just had a question in my mind, like, how do they really know to do this? It sounds like a simple question, but when you are a perpetual outsider, that question is pretty loud because growing up as a teenager in this country, I never knew I had a voice or how to use it. But here were these teenagers who were just keenly aware of the plight before them. And so that's where the idea for the book came, was just trying to figure out what the origin story was of resistance and protesting and using your voice as the ultimate weapon. And that's how the book started.
So, yeah, I mean, it seems like part of the answer to that question, how did they know, lies in the history of that you so well cover and resist, which is that,
Yeah.
I mean, there's so much about the current moment I wanna ask you about, but I also
Yeah.
wanna delve into the history of Black youth activism because, people are not that well educated, especially, dumb white people. Um,
Oh,
at
no.
at a point where the Republican Party is, actively trying to erase Black history from textbooks and classrooms, could you walk us through a few of the watershed moments of Black youth activism that continue to shape the movement? I mean, in particular, maybe a few of the relatively unsung heroes and events of the movement over the past century that have really shaped the present moment and brought us here.
Yeah, I mean, I think overarchingly, when I think about just all the people I cover in the book, as you mentioned in the intro, the one thing that stands out to me, and my main key takeaway is that this freedom that we know so well right now was not free, right? Someone had to die for it, someone had to bleed for it, and someone had to fight for it. And this goes all the way back to, the 1900s, where the idea of freedom was still new. I mean, think about formerly enslaved people having to think about what it meant to be free, and they had to make sure they could fight to enshrine their freedom into the law. And that's where we get the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But some of the key figures from there really stand out that I really had so much kind of like aha moments researching. For example, Barbara Johns. I mean, I think many people know Linda Brown when you think about the Brown versus Board of Education case, but Barbara Jones was such a pivotal figure who is often left out of that conversation. She was just 16 years old in 1951 when, simply put, she just got tired of being tired, right? So every day from her home, she would drive down the all-white high school, Farmville High School, on her way to her school, and she would see Farmville High School get new buildings, new libraries, new gardens, and then she'll pull up to her school and they're having classes in tar paper shacks where when it rained on them. The school grew, and when it grew, the overcrowding had to be shifted to the school buses. And what is so fascinating about Barbara Johns is she was living in Jim Crow, where basically she was told from birth that she was less than, that she was subjugated just because of her skin color. But here she was looking at this thing, and she said, so because I am Black, because I'm a Black child, I don't get the same resources as the other white children just because of how I was born. And there's something powerful about just the mind. The fact that she said to herself, if we don't do this fight, if we, the students, don't stand up and do something, nothing is going to get done. Because at that time, their parents were going to school district meetings, trying to rally for some kind of support for new buildings, new books, just something to show that the school districts cared about Black little children, but they did not. And Barbara John said, this is our fight. Look, our parents, they've tried to speak on our behalf, but if we all band together, right, if we all come together and just have a massive strike, they have to pay attention. And they did. So her strike was so disruptive, it caught the attention of the NAACP, who at the time they were going around the South trying to look for more use cases to take up to the Supreme Court. And what is so fascinating about Barbara Johns is of the 5 consolidated cases that went up to the Supreme Court under Brown, there were a total of 177 student plaintiffs. Of that total, 117 came from Prince Edward County, a result of Barbara John's fight. So it's this small county, but this one little girl who
In
just fought
Farmville is, clear.
farm in
Farm, yeah, yeah.
yeah, in Virginia. Um, and I just find it so fascinating that she just decided, what's the alternative to this life? We have a life sentence of being inferior. We have to do something. And because of that, we see the effects today. For sure, the education system is not fully integrated today. We still have social segregation by your zip code. So people can still see the disparity. But the fact that we have legal integration, that is far and beyond better than where it was before.
Wow. So I've heard you say before, and that history does not repeat itself, which is such a
Mm,
overused axiom that it is almost a cliche. But
yeah.
when you say history does not repeat itself, particularly with regard to y Black youth activism, what do you mean?
Yeah, I think history is the best teacher, right? I think where we are today is a bit grimmer than before. I say that because before, freedom was new and people had to fight for that freedom. Today, we're seeing liberties being stripped away because people don't have the intentionality to learn from history. So when you don't learn from history, you ignore history like it's this obscurity. You are bound to repeat the same mistakes because you're not looking to history as your teacher. You're not trying to understand how did we actually get here? How did we get this democracy that we have now? So history does not repeat itself. People are not intentional in looking at history to see the lessons that we need for today. If people did that, I think a lot of the missteps that we've seen lately, we would not have that because people would have turned and understood, okay, when this was done then, this was the outcome. But yet we're repeating the same cycle. I feel like that's why every generation has to carry the mantle to ensure that the freedoms that were fought for is sustained, especially now where things are being regressed, right? There's no more progress, I feel like, for people who are subjugated. It's a regression. You see the affirmative action being gutted. We see, for example, Roe. So all these things are being pulled back and being gutted is a regression of the kinds of liberties that were fought for. So without that understanding, there's a lack of empathy and perspective, and people just remain siloed.
Well, you're so good at your talking points that you're answering questions before I can answer them.
Oh,
One of them was, do you see parallels in history with our current time? Like, I'm thinking about the 1950s and early 60s, and, how are things better for Black America in 2025 than they were in 1963? Or in many cases, are they worse? Because the
so
sense was that there was more. I mean, my sense as somebody that's outside this is that there was more unity, more, like the tide was more in a positive direction, and as you
mm,
just you keep using the word regression, and we're seeing it
yeah,
everywhere,
yeah.
and when we talk about history, it's like most young people don't really even know anything about Nazis. They don't know about what happened in Germany between 1933 and the start of the war in
Well, book
1945.
bans too impact that. The book bans are impacting that as well.
Second most banned book in America right here in
Yeah.
2020. I wanna, later talk a little bit about
Yeah.
2020 because that was such a sort of watershed moment. So is
Yeah.
the overall feeling that you get when you travel
Mhm.
around and you talk to organizers and Black youth activists, is the feeling as positive as it was, say, in 1963, which is often considered sort of the height of the civil rights movement? Is the feeling as positive and optimistic and or is there some sense of futility?
Yeah, I think that's a great and complex question because when you think about the 1960s, like I said earlier, like freedom was still a novelty, it was still a new idea. And what the civil rights movement really did and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did was it enshrined the protections of race and the like into the law. So prior to that, it wasn't. So it was now illegal, for example, to just go around and discriminate on someone based on their skin color. So I think the sentiment then was a bit more there was a bit more energy to it because it was so new, and for the first time you had the protections that were needed to ensure that people of color were getting the same access. The problem is the access issue is not about the law because laws don't change people. Laws tell people if you do X, this is what's going to happen. So it doesn't change that racist who is now the gatekeeper at that school or at that job or at that institution. So therefore, even though the protections exist in law, it doesn't change the mindset of that person who feels that that Black student does not deserve admissions to this PWI college or anything like that. So I think the sentiment then in trying to fight to ensure that the laws were being changed were higher, but the actual change hasn't been sustained the way it could have been, especially today. Today, I think the fight is progressing, but when you have someone like Trump in office who is just intentional and open about his bigotry, and his hate of all others, it's almost hard to fight because we have to vocalize our opposition, but we're vocalizing our opposition, and what's happening? Is it just going into the void now? Because Trump, for example, he runs and owns all the agencies right now, the security, the intelligence, the army, the military. He has sycophants in all of these places. So it's almost like, where's the check and balances? But that doesn't mean you stop fighting, because you have to understand that what the people that I write about, what they knew and understood firsthand was, your voice is your ultimate weapon. Your voice is your ultimate ally. Even in the face of what seems insurmountable, you still have to continue to fight. So I think right now the focus needs to be on the midterms. Make sure that they get the House back. Like, there needs to be some kind of hope. I understand it seems hopeless because almost every day something crazy is happening in this new administration. But
Yeah, you have
that
to
doesn't
reteach yourself how to find the optimism.
exactly.
There's certain people like Rebecca Solnit, there's people whose
Yeah.
lists you follow that just little reminders when we're overwhelmed by this barrage of things, that little things are being made. And perhaps the greatest thing we have going for us is the fact that these people are so incompetent. You know what I
Mm,
mean? Like, imagine a room full of Donald Rumsfelds trying to do the same thing. They're going to get a
right.
lot more traction. They're smarter.
Yeah.
They're more. These people are just nefarious thugs, and
Yeah.
and and the hope is one thing that we're talking about now. You know, this backlash against racism, where I hear white people say, "I'm not entitled," and I'm like, "Oh, really? Everything if you get pulled over, for a routine traffic violation, are you worried for your life?"
Yeah.
They're like, "Well, why would I be worried about it?" Well, there you go. You're
Yeah.
entitled more than you ever give your credit for. What seems like a big obstacle for me right now in the resistance would be there's so much baiting going on. You know what I
Sure.
mean? Not only, the Trump has worked the racists up to where, I'm looking at pictures of people hanging White Lives Matters over freeway overpasses and things like this, and it seems I'm seeing memes for organized resistance events that I can't even trust the
Mm.
veracity of them, because I don't know, is this a thing where
Yeah.
they're gonna bait protesters out there, and then there's gonna be brown shirts, and they're gonna incite violence, and then the violence is gonna be blamed on BLM, which we've seen so many times, and same with,
Right.
the anti-fascist movement, where suddenly the protesters that are trying to do good become the bad guys in the eyes of the
Yeah.
mainstream media or
Right.
whatever. Um, but with the backsliding in voting rights and affirmative action and inclusion and the exodus from the Democratic Party and just this glee I'm talking about, which is megas are celebrating lost ground in the DEI arena, it appears the culture is moving backwards in so many ways. And
Mm.
here the resistance has gained so much ground over the century, and yet suddenly it feels like the yardstick is being moved back. So I just keep wondering, how does this change the movement tactically speaking? For every reaction, there is a reaction. So, like,
Right.
short of violence, you know what I mean? Which at some point, because I'm kind of a hair trigger tempered person, at some
Yeah.
point, like, violence looks like whether it logically or rationally looks like it intuitively feels like and I would think that this is something that one would want to avoid at all costs.
But I think right now, though, I think the issue I think a lot of analysts and political scientists are facing is we've literally never been here before. I hate this word, but it's really unprecedented times. I feel like since Trump has entered politics, everything is just upended. But I think there needs to be a new strategy. I think the Democratic Party has a lot to work on, and I'm not even sure they know what they need to do, right? So because everything is changing and what Trump is doing every single day, no one can really forecast the ripple effects of it because it's just so disruptive, right? Firing agencies that actually protect the security of our nation, like it's so mind-boggling that I think a lot of people who are in the know and trying to figure out what's the next move for the DNC and for the party, I don't think they have an answer because everything is just up in the air and upended. But I do think that the way you continue to try is a word to glean hope is you find a way to be part of the solution where you are, right? You have to hyper localize it right now. So in your neighborhood, how can you be part of the solution? If you know a family in your neighborhood who has mixed immigrant status, maybe become an ally and say, hey, if you do get picked up by ICE and you have your children, I can take care of them. Or here are some things you can do. Make sure you know your rights. If you do know your rights, here's how you can protect your family. I think right now, every single person who feels like they're mourning America because they're the half of the nation who did not vote for Trump, I think we really need to start being more solution oriented in our locale because right now there's just too much happening. I think the party really needs to figure out how they realign themselves with the working class because right now they do have that image of being catering to the coastal elites, and that's how they lost this last election. Is they had forgotten in a way, in a very subconscious way, about the working class people who first were their greatest supporter, and Trump appeared to be this outsider, which he really isn't. But the way his talking points, he had a great chief of staff now, Susie Wiles, who knew how to make sure their messaging outside of those rallies were on point. She was hitting inflation, Bidenomics, the trans issue, and they were consistent. Whereas everything that the nation was suffering from, they always found a way to make sure they found sound bites from Kamala to say she's against this. She wants your young children to be trans, things like that. So I think the party needs to find a way to communicate with the working class people again and realign themselves with that coalition. Otherwise, 2026 and 2028 is going to be a washout, right? And again, all the actions that Trump is taking right now, we have no clue what the impact is going to be by the end of this year, next year, by the end of his term. So again, I think the way to stay focused and to vocalize your opposition is find a way for you to be part of the solution. If it means starting a book club where all you do is support the banned books, do that, right? If it means making sure you have a kids program where kids can go and learn about diversity and inclusion, do that. If you are working in a corporation, a big corporation, and you're a white person, be an ally. If DEI was good in a corporation, be an ally and say, hey, I want to help build a talent pipeline to ensure that we're going to HBCUs, to ensure that we're going to community colleges. So I think right now we need to hyper localize how we can be part of the solution. And I understand things are very grim, but I think sitting this aside and being passive right now is being complicit.
I think that's a brilliant strategy to not only Black youth activism, but to capitalism, to everything.
Right,
We had my friend Josh Fernandez on recently, who's an anti-fascist organizer, and he is a boots to the ground. That's all he does is build
right,
community, like at his college, in his neighborhood, food drives, everything like that. I
right.
mean, when the system, when this overarching system is corrupt and broken, that's the only way to
It
change it
is.
is within, and laugh if you will, but if we're talking about it in a capitalist sense, that means stuff like farmers markets and craft brewing and just, you know what I mean,
Yes.
hyper localized. I love this. This is the
Yeah.
most hopeful take I've heard on it is because
Yeah.
because you feel so helpless. I mean, short of flooding the phone banks,
Yeah.
and even that starts locally, I think. Start with your
Yeah.
representatives, start at
Exactly.
a city level, county level, and work
Yeah.
deductively up and sort of build strength.
Exactly.
I think that idea is really hopeful because you feel so much more connected. It's easier for me to feel connected to my school district or my, versus like me against this gigantic republic where the checks and balances suddenly aren't working, and
Exactly.
being eroded. And
Yeah.
and another thing you said that really hit me and is this idea that the left really has sort of alienated rural America, and
Yep.
that's not just with Trump. I mean, the Clintons did it too.
Yeah.
Once the new Democrat came around and basically was just the new Democrat was basically a moderate Republican 30 years before that. You know what
Right.
I mean?
Right.
That to me, besides, Reagan for me is a big turning point, and
Yeah.
then the Clintons are a turning point because it was kind of almost more of the same policy wise, whereas that was a perfect moment for the Democratic Party to become, I felt like more leftist, more, you know what I
Mm.
mean? Like, and
Mhm. Yeah.
instead it moved towards, I mean, I hesitate to even call it centrist because it was almost just Republican.
Right.
Um, that was brilliant. Today's political environment, clearly it feels more racist than anything I've ever experienced in my lifetime. And in my lifetime, we were still, when I was young, we were still hearing racial slurs is like,
Right.
just colloquially, you know what I
Yeah.
mean? That wasn't even a no-no yet. And yet still, I feel like we're living in a time right now that's more racist than I ever felt. I mean, do you feel like this trend could inspire a separatist movement? I mean, like the Black Panthers in the
Mm.
60s, or I mean, like,
Mm.
it's just
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know. I think because right now so many things are just happening all at once, and I think young people especially are trying to have a different strategy, right? Because think about the Black Lives Matter movement. It catapulted after Michael Brown's killing in 2000, and I think uh, 14 2014. Yeah, 2014, because last year made 10 years. So I think there was a different kind of urgency then because so much was happening and there was almost like this neglect coming from the system, which there is still today. But I think so much has happened in terms of the change in administrations, obviously. So now I think Trump has just been that turning point. And I think everyone is just trying to figure out how do we fight this? We are moving into what feels like an oligarchy, and so there needs to be a new strategy, right? So the stomping the street, the fist pumping, that's still great. But I think there needs to be a new kind of strategy. So you see someone like a David Hogg, he's now the vice chair of the DNC, super young Gen Z. I think that's what we need right now. We need more intergenerational coalitions that understand because young people, what I love about young people is they're very idealistic. They want to change everything, break things fast, and then they get older and they realize, oh, we need to be a bit more strategic. So when you have an open intergenerational coalition who listens and they really want to solve the problem, not just be the loudest one in the room, I think that's where you start to see things move. And I think that's the new kind of protest and activism we're seeing with this new Trump era. Because with Trump, he does things that doesn't make sense, like logical political sense. And so you need a new approach to what we've seen before. And I think that requires that intergenerational connection and community and just more strategic approaches to how things can be done and solved. Because activism doesn't mean just stomping the street, right? It just means you're doing something, you're performing some action that's going to lead to some political or social change. And that could mean anything. So I think I'm a bit more hopeful now when I see the likes of David Hoggs being inside the DNC. So having that voice in there, that's a way I think we can start to see more of a different kind of coalition moving forward.
yeah, it's amazing throughout history, wherever there's resistance, how heavily we lean on youth. I mean, resist is all about the
Yeah.
young Black activists. It seems it's always the youth fighting for social change, and I kinda wanna keep talking about why that is. I mean, I know
Yeah.
part of it has to do with idealism, which
Yeah.
tends to soften us all as we get, people get older, their incomes go up. Often, if we're following sort of this sort of general continuum of life, they become a little more complacent. But at the same time, it seems like the class that is most the class that is most best positioned to help would be middle-aged professionals, the people that have the doctorates, the people that are lawyers, the people that are doctors, the people, you know what I mean? The people
Yeah.
that have developed these specific skills to deal with bureaucracies,
Right.
to deal with the power structure, who are
Yeah.
already empowered by virtue of their backgrounds and educations. So what you're talking about, and I think we kind of saw this in the 60s civil rights movement, where
Yeah.
there were some elder statesmen like King and people like that
John
working
Lewis,
yeah,
who
John
was in his
Lewis
20s.
working
Yeah.
with the young people. What I mean, why else do we just depend on youth? Because they're easier to they mobilize themselves, or
I don't think we depend on youth. I think they remind us of the idealism that we should all never lose. Like, think about John Lewis, for example. He was the idealistic young, 19, 20-year-old who was working alongside Dr. King. And why they liked having him in that coalition is because he reminded them he injected this energy that they needed. Because when you get older, think about Dr. King. The first time he got involved, he was 26 years old, leading the bus boycott, right? So he was idealistic. He wanted to fight. But then something happens when you mature. You start to understand to fight, There's a lot of red tape. There's a lot of
And if you
bureaucracy
have
that
kids and things like that, the more baggage you sort of, or a mortgage or just things
life
is
happens, right?
yeah.
And you forget the youth, but also young people remind us about the Constitution, remind us that we have to keep fighting for that perfect union. So I don't think young people is like a burden on them, but they're needed as part of the sustaining the fight because they remind us why we started in the first place. Like when you get older, you still understand that the fight is necessary, but now you have the experience of understanding how, for example, Congress works. A lot of young people that I know who got into Congress, I have some friends in Congress who got into Congress, they wanted to break things fast. Then you get in there, you realize to get one bill passed, you need a bipartisan support, you need this support, and it's not as easy. So even if your idea to solve this one thing in your community sounds logical, you then realize there's politics involved, there's politicking involved, and you have to make sure you're getting both sides interested in your one bill. So the older people get, especially if you're in politics and governance, you understand that there's certain red tape you just cannot avoid. It's just politics. So young people are necessary to the fight because they remind us of why we got in the first place before we got blinded by the bureaucracy and the red tape. So that's why I think, again, intergeneration coalitions are so important.
Yeah, and that idealism can be contagious, you're right, that's a
It
great
really
point.
is. The energy is so contagious.
Where the young people may lack some understanding of the bureaucracies of
Yeah.
politics, one thing they do understand far better than us is the movement of culture via, say, now would be
Yep.
social networks.
Oh,
Like Johnetta
yes.
Elzie back in the 2010 was able to use Twitter and other platforms to such great organizing effect, and she was able to amplify marginalized voices. But here we are a little more than a decade later, and the
Yeah.
social networks have become a cesspool of misinformation. The right has learned to weaponize social media.
Yeah.
How do we still use that as a tool to help young activists organize and communicate? And I shouldn't say we help young activists. How do young activists help us? Because they're
Yeah.
the ones that understand you know what I mean? Like, I barely know Instagram, let alone TikTok and,
I'm not on any social media.
Snapchat. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, so like, is it ruined though? I mean, is misinformation
Mm.
and a lack of moderation and, just an overabundance of misinformation, is it making it are we even qualified to answer this? A less, being above 25 years old, are
Yeah.
a less effective means of organization and
I
mobilization.
Yeah, I think social media, on its face, it's inherently just silos, right? So people go on there and they have their individualized communities, right? So young activists, they have their own silo where it's still an effective tool to quickly mobilize and galvanize, even though you still have, for example, the far right pushing their misinformation. But when you think about it, they're pushing their misinformation to people who go on there looking to have their already preconceived notions confirmed. So social media on its face, it's inherently just siloed. People are insulated by the things that they already want to be confirmed on. So I think when it comes to mobilizing activists and young Black activists, they follow the algorithm based on their followers will keep them in their silo. So they're still able to mobilize and galvanize people who are interested in activism and resistance, the same way you have, the far right who do the same activism, the same mobilizing. But again, social media is just so divided and siloed that like you're on there and it's like your own little world and you're just tunnel visioned into the things that you want to see, you want to hear. So unfortunately, disinformation, misinformation is going to continue to be an issue until some way, somehow, I think we need some kind of guardrails put on social media. We need some kind of fact checking, which Mark Zuckerberg says we don't need, right? So when you have the leaders of the social media platforms taking away something that can be a guardrail to spread truth, it tells you a lot that every administration impacts the information that goes out.
Yeah, nothing says autocracy like, that, like,
Exactly.
I'm going to the so but would you agree that, because this is a debate I have often with my friends on Facebook, which is the only one, that's the old people social network, but, like, every time I'm seeing a friend, like, I'm unfriending all these MAGA people I went to I don't think that's a good idea. I'm a believer in keeping I think it is important to know what they're up to. I
Yeah.
everyone's always going I'm so dumb, everyone's always going to Blue Sky. I keep calling it Blueski because that's the way I read it. Like, that's how out of the loop I am, but,
Yeah.
like, I'm like, that just seems like an echo chamber to me. I guess it could be a good organizing tool because there isn't gonna be the noise of
Yeah.
this racist dissent and obfuscation there, so it could be good for
Yeah.
that. But at the same time, I feel like culturally it's so important to be able to hear what's going on the other side, to understand the logic, as stupid as it is, of this emboldened, this MAGA cult.
Yeah, there's a story I share in the epilogue of the book where in one of my stops, I think it was in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where I spent about 30 minutes in this burnt down parking lot that was burnt during the protesting of another young black man who was shot by police. And I think that this elderly white couple, and we disagreed more times than we agreed, but it was one of the best conversations I had on the trip because I know firsthand that unity is not that we agree, right? Otherwise, then there'll be no need for unity.
Word, yeah.
Unity is saying that I want to understand your perspective so I can better understand you. And understanding leads to more empathy and it leads to more perspective. So I think unfriending people who don't share your views is almost saying that you just want to know your way of thinking. Nothing wrong with that, but I think if you're
That's kinda
really
human nature,
right,
unfortunately,
there's
yeah,
nothing
to
wrong with that, but yeah, but if you're really intentional about wanting to learn and grow, like I'm very curious about how people think. For example, what my I went to Stewart, Nebraska. It's a small town when I was traveling in 2020. A small town of 400 people, all white people, all Republicans. Now imagine growing up there, all you know is Stewart, Nebraska. You've never seen a black person. I mean, I was stared at, I was pointed at, but to them, I was like their first, maybe the first black person they've ever seen. But when you have someone who grew up so insulated, I can't blame that person for not knowing because they truly don't know what they don't know. And you can only imagine the kind of textbooks they're being taught in your schools. They may leave out Black history because to them it doesn't matter. I don't know. I didn't look into that. But so when I think about just how our minds are formed, it's our lived experiences, what we're exposed to. So it's unfair on the one hand to judge someone who thinks one way of the world because that's the way they were brought up. But then if you are exposed to something and then you choose to hate, you choose to be racist, that's a different conversation. If your friend that you unfollow on Facebook tells you, I think all black people are murderers and stupid and, and uneducated, ask them why they think that, right? Because maybe they've never met a black person. Maybe they're just repeating something they heard Trump say, right? So I think we need to get to a point in our society where we're more understanding, more empathetic, and try to widen our perspective.
free college. This is what I think about
Yes,
this is what makes me think of
exactly.
that is because, I grew up in a small town, but I also, like, went to the city whenever possible, a small town close enough to the city that I
Yep.
escaped to it, and I think the importance to college more than the actual liberal arts education for kids from, like, small towns like the one I live in now, Sequim, Washington, I think the kids would benefit from just because, when you go to college and you grow up in an insular place, that's
Yeah,
where you meet your first friends of color, that's where you meet your
exactly.
first non-binary friends. This is when you meet firsthand and say, "Hey, just because I haven't seen this before, I don't need to be afraid of it. This is really cool." And I know
Precisely.
you're not supposed to the way we stated it in the '80s, like, when I was a little punk rocker, and you can't I don't even think you could politically correctly say is that, but was let your freak flag fly. And that
Mm,
was something to be celebrated. That was like,
yeah,
let's celebrate that every one of us is our own unique freak in our own way. We
right,
were all raised and I think if you opened up college to everybody, more importantly than the actual really more important than what's in the textbooks almost, is that experience
right.
of meeting a more diverse and more dynamic group of people and hearing new voices because things tend to be very monocultural in a small town.
Right. In psychology, that's just called exposure therapy. Like whatever you don't know, you have to expose yourself to it so you can learn it and be more comfortable around it.
So in the past, when we talk about the Black Youth Resistance Movement, there's been groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Um, are there similar organizations at work today under a larger umbrella, or is it just BLM a larger, all-encompassing thing? Are they still Is there still on an organizational level stuff happening on college campuses? Clearly, I haven't been on one in a
Yeah.
while.
There's a lot. I mean, I think Dream Defenders, I mean, Black Lives Matter is definitely the overarching movement where a lot of people were activated in 2014 after Michael Brown's death. And there's so much more smaller ones happening on college campuses all over the nation. So they may not have an actual name or actual, founding or group name. But there's a lot of young movements around the nation, especially on college campuses, especially following what happened on October 7th. You saw a lot of mobilizations across the nation on college campuses. So I think right now they may not have a formal name or a formal
Like a
organization, but there's
charter or whatever, yeah.
right, or yeah, or foundation or anything like that. But they are activism still going on by young students and young people.
Yeah, there was a seismic shift between 2020 and 21.
Yeah.
Suddenly, talking about racism became a problem. This is when critical race theory really started to come under attack, and suddenly words like, women, systemic, bias, black, gender. I mean, some pretty basic words in our dialogue were suddenly what does the backlash to that look like? I mean, they're rolling back DI initiatives to the, and major corporations so big that we can hardly talk about, boycotting them. I mean, GM and Google and McDonald's and Walmart and Disney, all of these
Yeah.
companies that own, how do you fight this? I mean, it isn't, I mean, they're fighting it through legislation. They're trying to push through legislation that says you
Mhm.
can't say them there on your letters or, I mean, like, how do you fight back for that if not just getting through to people, like, just on a personal level, like
Right.
the importance of not marginalizing or objectifying individuals?
Yeah, I mean, first, we have to think about what was the objective of DEI in the first place, right? And it really took off in 2020 following George Floyd's death, where we saw the black boxes on social media. It was very reactive. Every company, big corporations, they were adding thousands and millions of dollars to DEI initiative, but like, what was it? Right? The issue I had with it, I wasn't really a big proponent of it in that way because it was reactive, it was performative, and it wasn't how they call the smart kind of way of doing it. It wasn't specific, it wasn't measurable. There was really no way you can see would it be achievable? Was it relevant to what they were trying to accomplish? And there was no time constraint put on it. So all these big corporations were saying, we're going to invest this, we're going to do this, but there was no measurement. There was no way to really assess what they were actually doing and what they were trying to accomplish. So for me, in the beginning, I saw this as just 100% performative. So now that we're seeing the backlash, now that we're seeing the federal agencies kind of pushing away from DEI, I think what we need to do is go back to your point to localizing it, right? At every corporation, they have ERGs, employee resource groups. I think that's where it starts. I think if you're really invested in diversity and equity and inclusion, you need to go back to your companies, whoever, whatever allies are out there, think about how you can be effective. Think about how you can propose to the executive committee, look, we need to expand our talent pipeline to go to the HBCUs and the community colleges. I think beyond just saying DI and having this fancy label that is, as they call wokey now, it doesn't do much for the actual marginalized communities who actually want to be hired by these institutions, but they keep being left behind. So if you have a specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time constraint goal to say, we want to include diversity, and here's these specific plans, including the talent pipeline, that's where it starts. If you really want to have more women, people of color, people with disabilities in your company, find a way to include them in the talent pipeline and make sure those gatekeepers have the moral consciousness to say, we are trying to do this thing intentionally. So the whole DEI campaign from 2020 to now, honestly, it was performative, it was reactive, it really did nothing but talk. So I think if you're really interested in including more people in your corporation, in your institution, in your schools, put together, again, an interracial, intergendered coalition of people at your company, at your institution to say, what do we do, right? You don't need the label DEI to say you want to increase inclusion in your company or in your
Specificity, just more specificity. I
right,
like it.
and then do it.
Specialization.
And
Yeah,
do it
no,
and then
that's yeah.
measure it. A lot of those companies in 2020 who are investing thousands of dollars in DEI, how are we measuring this? What is the outcome? No one ever came back to say, oh, we hired X amount. And think about it too, in publishing, they hired all these, Black women, Black men into top positions in editing role. 2 years later, they were all let go. So it was
Yep.
very performative. It was very disappointing. If you're really interested in including more people in your corporation, in your institution, be serious about it and give a specific plan and let's measure it after a year or two.
Man, you're getting me fired up. I like this. No, I mean it. Well, I mean this is tact. This
It
is
needs to be
tact.
practical. Yeah, it
Yeah,
needs to be
yeah, yeah. No,
practical.
I like it. You just small, specific. You can't eat the
Yeah.
elephant one bite at a time, and I think it
Is
makes it all feel so
exactly.
much less overwhelming. I feel really
Right.
hopeful. Um, If you were to amend Resist today, and write a chapter, and I know it's a recent book, so we're only going back about 8 months probably here from the time you finished it till it went into production, maybe a year. But if you were to write a chapter for today, what might that look like? I mean, how have things changed recently, like very recently? What's next? And one thing I'd love you to leave us with is who are some of the Ella Bakers of today? Like, maybe some names. Give us some
Mm,
names of people we can follow on, you know what I mean?
yeah.
N n y
Yeah, no, I think like the last chapter, that's exactly what I was trying to do in chapter 9, where I talk about Donnella Frazier and how she really sparked this new generation of youth activism and young people. And so I named a few people who are, really young and they got into office. And I think that is the new strategy. I think I'm seeing a lot of young people, younger, getting into local offices. Layla DeWise, for example, she's covered in the last chapter. She's an unknown figure, but she did a lot of work in Portland. That's how her group is called the Youth, I believe, Youth PDS Movement. And that's how I first got interested in writing this book. So there are a lot of people who are in office, a lot of people on college campuses doing a lot of great work. Johnetta Elzie is still doing local work in her community in Ferguson and in Missouri. And so I think a lot of young people around the nation. There's just not one, but I think that Layla DeWise is one that comes to mind because she really did something powerful in 2020 and continued to do so at her college campus. So there's so many ways we can support, by being allies and again, use whatever you can to be an activist because you can, as a writer, writing is my form of resistance. And again, it goes back to finding your voice and understanding that you do have a voice and using that voice for good because it is your ultimate weapon.
I hope you're listening, people. She is Rita Omokha. She is a badass, and she is the author of Resist: How a Century of Young Black Activists Saved America. Thank you so much, Rita, for being our fresh face in hell today.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate you.
A Fresh Face in Hell with Jonathan Evison is brought to you by Fresh Face Pods and produced by Jason Botkin and yours truly. Check us out on Instagram, YouTube, or at our website at freshfacepods.tv. Don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter for updates and special content. And if you love the podcast, by all means, run out and buy all of Jonathan Evison's award-winning novels wherever books are sold.